This session, Free Black Communities in 19th Century Louisiana, is set to be one of the most scholarly sessions, I hope, at the entire convention. We have thus far two very fine papers. We have three in the programs. The third one we're still waiting to hear from. All of them are excellent research presentations. And all of these candidates are PhD students at Louisiana State University's Department of History. I will introduce them in the order in which they will make their presentation. My first candidate that will present her paper is a person after my own heart. I first met Evelyn, and she may not remember this, as we waited in the hallway at the F.G. Clark Activity Center for the University of Dr. Jeffrey Wissington as president. I was introduced to her by her colleague, Professor William Mayfield. After a successful career as the Horatio Thompson Professor of Law, Evelyn decided to return to earn a doctorate in history. We miss her at Southern University's law school, but I know she's on to greater and outstanding achievements in history as well. She reminds me of my good friend Thomas Davis, who's at Arizona State, as well as Mayor Francis Berry up at University of Penn, both of whom have doctorates and JD degrees. She holds training with an AB from Oberlin College and a JD from the Paul M. Hebert. As Harry Truman said, Herbert Law School at LSU, the Hebert. She served business professorship at various law schools and had an illustrious career at the Southern University Law Center. And already several books under her name and numerous articles. Her presentation will be on the topic, Side by Side, Free People of Color in Plantation Country, West Feliciana Parish, Louisiana, 1820 to 1860. Our next presenter will be Professor J. Matthew Ward. He too is a gentleman after my own heart. He has an AA degree from Itawamba Community College in Fulton, Mississippi. My Associate of Arts degree, that's what the AA stands for, was from Utica Junior College. Although we were not called community colleges at that time, we are future JUCO graduates. And I think he told me he's a fellow Mississippian. This background certainly touched my heart as well. Professor Ward holds an AB degree from Mississippi University for women and an MA from the University of Missouri. His presentation, he has several book reviews and presentations at the recent Southern Historical Association annual meeting. His presentation will be on building freedom under military occupation. Our third presenter, as I indicated, is not with us. We hope he will come online. But we will start with Professor Wilson's very fine presentation. And I certainly hope this will become an extended presentation dealing with the free people of color in West Feliciana Parish. Professor Wilson.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I came to know of Free People of Parish. I need to get mechanical here. Okay. I came to know of Free People of Color in West Feliciana Parish through Charles Hatfield. In 1847, Hatfield sued the Louisiana State University to gain admission to its law school. When asked what prompted him to make such a demand, he replied that his descendants had lived and worked in Louisiana since the early 1800s and had earned for him the right to enjoy the benefits the state had to offer its citizens, to be trained in the law within the state of Louisiana with its mixed common, and civil law heritage, rather than to study outside of the state where only common law training was available, was one such privilege. Happel explained that his great-grandparents had been free. In the early 1800s, they had moved from Maryland and Philadelphia to West Feliciana Parish. His grandparents had met there and married in Baton Rouge after the Civil War. That any free person of color would leave a free state to move to a slave state struck me as odd. West Feliciana Parish still calls itself plantation country. It had an abundance of enslaved people. In 1835, Alexis B. Tocqueville wrote, "In the South, labor itself is stigmatized as degrading. In West Feliciana Parish, those with the means avoided that stigma by purchasing others to labor for them." This is a photograph taken from the Mississippi River. In the foreground, you see a riverboat. On the shore is the town of Bayou Sarah, which no longer exists. And then on the hillside, you see the town of St. Francisco. Enslaved people, using whatever rudimentary tools were available to them, did most of the labor-intensive work required to develop this. I'm sorry, somebody knocked on my door. Decided to develop this virgin land into a wealthy agricultural community. They cut the trees and prepared the land for crops. They planted and picked the cotton and laid and cut the sugar cane. They built the roads and bridges and constructed the homes and other buildings called for by a growing population. Historian Watine Fraser identified 38 planters in West Feliciana Parish who, in 1850, enslaved more than 100 people each. In addition, 106 free people of color lived and worked in the parish. West Feliciana Parish, free people of color population developed in various ways. Mary Ann Cornish, Lucindy Wilkins, Sarah Jackson, and others were children of free mothers, so were free from their birth. Hatfield's great-grandfather, George Dowse, moved from Philadelphia, and Drury Mitchell moved from South Carolina. Elsie Scott moved from New Orleans. Other free people of color came from New York, Massachusetts, Kentucky, Maryland, Indiana, and Ohio. Some free people of color were enslaved in the parish and continued to live there after they became free. When White Josias Gray emancipated Anne Maria and her children, Anne Maria built her home in Gray's front yard. Leah Savage, manumitted by a will in 1819, remained in the parish. George Murray, Old Man Dick, and Peggy Russell paid cash for their freedom and remained in the parish to enjoy it. William Chew purchased himself on a payment plan. From January to October 1827, he made irregular partial payments towards his $350 purchase price, and at 45 years old, he became free. 3.5 years later, he purchased his wife, Mariah, and bought a lot on Fidelity Street. By 1839, he had bought 4 of his children and 1 granddaughter from their various owners and had emancipated them. Chew continued to purchase town lots, and by 1841, he owned 7 lots, including 3 corner lots. Chew would purchase 11 town lots in all. In 1845, he was able to locate and purchase his son Wilson. Chew and his family stayed in the parish. Why? West Feliciana Parish offered an environment in which free people of color could find opportunities to support themselves and find a modicum of respect. People of color and white people interacted, exchanged property, and bore children together. They worshiped at the same church, patronized each other's businesses, and purchased each other's personal property. Despite the ubiquity of slavery, cordial interaction between free people of color and free white people was common in the parish. Betsy Gibbons donated 4 arpents of land to white Mary Thornsbury, whose husband had been interdicted as an incontinent. When Frank Bradford sold his house to white Hannah Forty, she allowed him to occupy the kitchen in the yard for the rest of his life, and her husband did not object to this arrangement. White Mr. Riddle invited a free person of color with whom he had been riding to eat with a group of Riddle's white friends. 3 people of color were baptized and married at the local Grace Episcopal Church and were buried by its rector. They purchased at the parish stores on credit, just as did white residents. Merchants recorded their purchases and payments alongside the purchases and payments of their white customers. There was no separate book for sales to free people of color and no apparent disparate treatment. In December 1820, after the probate sale of his deceased owner's property, Amos Hoe listened to others bidding for him and paid $1,200, the amount of the last bid, for his freedom. He had already purchased a lot in St. Francisville 2 months earlier. In 1822, he signed a promissory note for white Jacob Potter. When Potter failed to pay the note, he and Hoe were sued. Hoe successfully urged the court to have Potter's property seized and sold to pay the debt. Hoe paid only the remaining balance on the note. The following year, Hoe successfully sued the parish sheriff. Hoe had sold 2 horses to white William Kennedy and had not been paid. After Kennedy died, the sheriff seized and sold the horses to pay Kennedy's other debts. Hoe convinced the court that the horses belonged to him because Kennedy had not yet paid for them. The court ordered the sheriff to pay to Hoe the amount the sheriff received from the sale of the horses. Hoe had to sue Kennedy's estate for the remainder of the agreed-upon price. Hoe's transition from enslaved person to successful litigant in just 4 years suggests that West Feliciana Parish provided an environment that was not hostile to free people of color. Jeremiah Shelby died in 1822. At the sale of his property, white John Ketchum purchased a desk, a vest, a beaver hat, and a razor. Other white people purchased pantaloons, a cloth coat, shirts, boots, and shoes. The white purchasers showed no temerity in acquiring property that had once belonged to free people of color. There was no stigma attached to the property, nor was there condemnation of the white people who purchased it or of other white people who associated with free people of color. In an otherwise binary world of enslaved black people and free white people of color were an integral part of the free white community and not separate from it. Opportunities for employment allowed free people of color to stay in the parish. As was typical in other areas of the South, most of the free people of color in West Feliciana Parish practiced skilled trades or engaged in service-related occupations. There were seamstresses and barbers, a shoemaker, a woodcutter, a brick molder. William Chew was a drayman, as were his 2 sons and 2 other free men of color. Drury Mitchell was a master carpenter who had enough work and enough skill that he made use of apprentices. In 1838, a judge permitting a 12-year-old to become Mitchell's apprentice characterized Mitchell as a fit and proper person to be the master of said boy. Mitchell built a gin house, a mill, a 2-story framed house, and other business and residential structures for his customers. In 1850, 10 other free men of color, some of whom had been his apprentices, were carpenters. Some free women of color supported themselves with domestic duties. They took in washing and cared for people who were ill. In 1860, the census of the parish listed 9 free women of color as washerwomen or servants, and listed 1 as a midwife. Some free men of color were handymen or field hands. Thomas Bank planted a garden and did some carpentry work. Aaron Briggs agreed to work on a plantation as one of the hands. His pay was docked when he failed to show up for work, but he was not whipped. Other free men of color were waiters or laborers. 5 free people of color in West Feliciana Parish had significant success as restaurant and hotel owners. Nellie Wooten ran a hotel near the mouth of Bayou Sarah Creek from before 1820 until shortly before her death in 1853. Wooten kept a stable near her hotel and may have offered to transport her guests from the railroad or the docks to her hotel, or she may have transported people up the hill to the town of St. Francisco. In June 1853, Wooten sold Nellie's hotel to White William Glass for $3,500. When she died later that year, Wooten owned 8 other lots in Bayou Sarah. Those are Wooten's lots in Bayou Sarah, all valued at $8,000. Her personal property included mules, horses, oxen, cattle, promissory notes, a wagon, and cotton and corn. The 15 people she held in slavery were valued at $12,600. In 1831, George Dowse, Charles Hatford's great-grandfather, came to the parish as a mariner. He purchased about 3 acres of land on Woodbury Road and built Orange Hill, an inn and house of entertainment frequented by plantation gentry. Dowse's Orange Hill offered 3 meals a day, lodging for people, and boarding for horses. Parish residents held dinners, parties, and balls there. Dowse could supply champagne, ice cream, Havana cigars, and brandy to his guests. Letters written by his neighbors commented on those gatherings. One was well attended, another was dull for want of good music. Plantation owner Bennett H. Barrow, who kept a diary in the 1830s and 1840s, attended a party there and found it very pleasant. The Louisiana Volunteers Fire Department held a July 4th dinner there in 1836. Other restaurateurs included Maria Wicker and Henrietta Coleman, who owned adjoining properties in Bayou Sarah and Point Street. So that's their 2 properties there. Wicker had purchased her freedom and that of 3 of her children in 1842. She started a restaurant building business in 1845, and by 1855, Wicker had saved the $1,669 needed to purchase 2 of her adult sons, Albert and Edward, who were then in New Orleans. She's listed as a dairywoman in the 1860 census with $1,500 in real estate and $600 in personal property. Her neighbor, her hotel owner Henrietta Coleman, was listed as a washerwoman. Coleman's Henrietta House had 7 guest rooms and 2 servant rooms. Each guest room had a bedstead, 2 mattresses, a ewer and basin. One guest room had a piano. Coleman's parlor room had 9 parlor chairs, 5 pictures on its walls, and a Brussels carpet and rug on the floor. She had restaurant serving dishes, including 16 cake pans, and a refrigerator valued at $8. Her dining room had an extension table, and she kept 7 head of cattle. She could perhaps have been called a dairywoman, but not a washerwoman. In June 1876, when federal officials came to Louisiana Parish to investigate the killing of 30 or so Black men, the officials held their interviews at Coleman's Henrietta's house. In 1857, Hampton Whitaker bought a lot and its improvements for $2,000 and developed it into the China Grove Hotel. In 1859, he purchased the lot next door and expanded his hotel for those of those 2 lots. By the end of that year, he had leased the 2 lots where the China Grove Hotel was located to White Jackson Camp for 3 years at the rate of $1,000 per year. For an additional $1,500, Whitaker sold Vance all the furniture and furnishings in the hotel, except for the contents of Whitaker's room. Other free people of color engaged in other businesses. Jordan Richie came to Louisiana as a merchant, and this is where Wooten had her hotel and restaurant business. Jordan Richie came to Louisiana as a merchant. He died shortly after arriving from Kentucky and left behind barrels full of merchandise that he had hoped to sell. He was not an insubstantial merchant. Keisha Middleton was a business partner in two different businesses. White Antonio Picaluga purchased Middleton in 1825 and emancipated her in 1827. When he died in 1833, he left all his property to Middleton, including a flatboat that served as a grocery for vessels plying the Mississippi River. A year later, Middleton sold the flatboat to buy a lot in St. Francisville. In 1836, Middleton and White Jonathan Ellsworth together purchased a tract of land on Cat Island, where they set up a brickmaking business. Middleton's St. Francisville lot was used as collateral for the purchase. Some free people of color were farmers. Wheaton had 220 acres, Anne Maria Curtis had more than 200 acres, Carolyn Terry owned 100 acres, and Maria Gray owned 53 acres. And there were others who owned land. Many of the land holdings, whether town lots or rural tracts, were interspersed among properties owned by whites. There were no geographically defined Black communities in the parish. Free people of color lived where they wanted and where they could afford. In St. Francisville, free people of color purchased lots in square 14, square 27, square 24, square 10, square 9, and elsewhere. You see the lots are not contiguous. And by Sarah, they purchased lots in square 10, square 8, square 27, square 4, square 37, square 1, and in other squares. Free people of color lived next door to white people indiscriminately. Some of them lived in the same household. In 1820, 29 free people of color lived in households headed by white people. In 1850, 40 free people of color did. In many cases, these households with both free people of color and white people present resulted from white men in West Louisiana Parish having had children by the Black women they enslaved. An 1817 law prescribed the punishment of death for any slave or free person of color who attempted to rape the body of any white woman or girl. No such law protected a Black woman. Although any sexual relations between a male slaveholder and his enslaved female were necessarily coercive, then current law did not define these acts as rape. Louisiana's 1804 law of slavery defined a mulatto as a person with at least one grandfather or grandmother who was ethnically Black. In 1860, 1,208 people held in slavery were labeled mulatto. And you can see there's one of the parts I took out that free people of color were more likely to be mulatto because many slaveholders would free their children, and sometimes the mother of those children, but the children necessarily would be mulatto. So that's my next sentence. Some male slaveholders would free the mother of the children, who got the children to vote. White William Weeks acknowledged his relationship to a woman he had held in slavery in his May 1816 will. He wrote that he had freed the mulatto woman, Anne Maria Curtis, now living with me as housekeeper. He acknowledged her 4 children as his own and left 1/5 of his estate to Curtis and their children. In addition, Weeks gave his white adult son $16,000 to spend on their behalf. The interest of the money was to pay the cost of caring for and educating the children, and each child was to receive $4,000 from the principal as that child became an adult. White Thomas Purnell, the other great-grandfather of Charles Hatfield, brought enslaved Mary Martin with him to Louisiana in 1817 and lived with her in West Louisiana Parish until 1860, when they moved together to Baton Rouge. He freed her and their children and saw to it that his sons had land to farm. West Louisiana Parish was not a perfect place for free people of color to live. They had to carry proof of their freedom wherever they went and were required to display that proof to any white person who demanded to see it. State laws restricted the number of firearms they could possess and restricted their sale of alcohol. When the state contemplated free public schools, the state expressly excluded free children of color. Free people of color were instructed to never insult or strike white people. and to speak to them only with respect. West Louisiana was not a perfect place, but it was an acceptable place. Free people of color came, stayed, and made their living in the parish. The community was surprisingly open and accommodating to them. I thank you for your attention, and I welcome your questions.
Outstanding. Jay?
All right. First, I would like to say thank you for all the to all the wonderful LHA folks for putting this together. I know that we were all looking forward to having this meeting in person, but there were a lot of things that we were looking forward to this year that didn't quite pan out. But thank you for putting together this online version of the conference, and thank you, Professor Vincent, for introducing us and commenting on our papers. I appreciate your time and your energy. Under Union occupation in Civil War Louisiana, formerly enslaved Black laborers endeavored to protect their family units and reshape their liberation on the ground level. Before the considerable efforts to reform Black citizenship on national and state levels, Black laborers were using local interpersonal methods like mobility, informal marketplaces, and communal relationships to build an alternative society in the wartime South. Delivered from the lash, formerly enslaved people unfortunately often faced similar patterns of exploitation under Union control. Union officers implemented aggressive recruitment strategies, restricted Black movement and ownership, and exploited their labor for military use. In response, emancipated people resisted by forging avenues of recognition for themselves. Enlisted Black soldiers badgered their superiors for better conditions and respectful treatment of their family members. Black laborers walked off the job. They sold the goods of their former masters to endow a new life of their own. Their tenuous present was tinged with remnants of the past, but their efforts toward new life, in cooperation with or resistance to the administrative measures of Union occupation, slowly diminished slavery's influence in meaningful ways. Union occupiers were the conduit of relational authority in Civil War Louisiana. They curtailed or augmented the power of white property owners to maintain control over Black laborers. Conversely, they could restrict or facilitate expanded Black freedom in Union lines. As a managerial and coercive institution of government power, Union officials engineered a military state in which white Southern residents generally maintained a larger portion of inclusive citizenship rights and material substance than Black Americans. As a result, the Union military maintained the architecture of the past while it forged the uncertain future. Black labor in the ranks and in the fields and within private homes and on the levees undergirded the success of Union occupation. Perhaps more than any other managerial task, Union commanders fixated on levee repair. Throughout the occupation of Southern Louisiana, the Union Army used Black labor to build and repair levees, making it the most common engineering initiative among military endeavors. In September of 1862, military governor of Louisiana, Brigadier General George F. Shepley, instructed Jacob Weitzel, syndic of Jefferson Parish, to convene a planter jury to examine levees in the vicinity of Orleans and Jefferson Parish and determine how to repair them. At the same time, he ordered the commander of Camp Parapet to employ a force of no less than 80 contraband laborers to repair the levees around New Orleans under direction of Weitzel. In 1862 and 1863, Shepley alone issued 6 orders for Black laborers from prisons or contraband camps to work on levees in these parishes. Additionally, Union commanders authorized Black labor to work on other military projects as well as civilian undertakings. The bureaucratic forms issued by the Army reveal the extent of Union occupational power, as well as they render visible the personal practices among Black laborers and white employers. In late April 1864, Thomas W. Conway, who was then superintendent of labor in Louisiana, dispatched 50 blank registration forms to the Provost Marshal headquarters in Brashear City. Now, this is present-day Morgan City in St. Mary Parish. These registration forms were to be distributed among the officers, government employees, and even private citizens who employed formerly enslaved persons. The forms would contain information that Conway would in turn build into a registry of labor. Quote, all colored persons living about town or about the camps should be enrolled on these blanks, Conway instructed, whether employed by others or for their own private good, end quote. As a tool of military occupation, this registry mapped the Louisiana social landscape. Registration informed Conway and other Union officials not only of the numbers and context of Black labor, but also depicted the compliance of white citizens to Union authority. Conway's order hints at the extent to which formerly enslaved people had expanded into local marketplaces. Black people worked in the fields, they bartered goods along the roadside, they'd sold oysters to Union troops, they found domestic employment in households, and a host of other personal labors. The Union Army wanted to make labor legible so that it could maintain social order among Black and white Louisianans. The contracts held white employers to essential standards of pay and behavior, but did not dismantle a labor environment where white property owners possessed power over Black labor. As an occupation tool, labor contracts signified new interlocking tripartite relationships between formerly enslaved people, white citizen employers, and the Union military. Union occupation forces called on employers to explicitly give the name of their Black employees, specify their wages, and maintain some semblance of human respect for workers. While the relative dominance of white landholders did not vanish, employers did have to customize their command of labor to fit the protocols of Union oversight. Adam Hawthorne, a manager on the Glen Orange plantation, illustrated the independence of Black laborers when he reported numerous problems on his plantation to Provost Marshal Albert Stearns in St. Mary Parish. One of his workers had run away with another man's wife. Another had apparently lost or stolen a new axe. 3 others departed for the Ramon plantation without notice, despite having signed year-long contracts with Hawthorne. Since freed laborers were under Union protection, he urged Stearns to make the workers return. Wages also presented a problem. Quote, unless they get goods or money for their full earnings, they are dissatisfied, and in fact, they are anxious to oversee their wages, close quote. Another laborer named Daniel Lyerly left without paying for the clothes he was provided by the plantation owner. A man named John Batu also plagued the plantation and surrounding properties by stealing chickens, pigs, and ducks. Hawthorne complained of, quote, idle people with bad character, unquote, like a man who hung around the property and swore loudly. He requested Stearns to discipline these men. When Black laborers departed plantations where they previously worked in bondage, even after they signed contracts, they severed their relationship to slavery. Much to the frustration of white property owners, workers did not recognize the unquestioned authority of white masters under Union occupation. Departure was perhaps the most salient of Black reconfigurations to race relations in the white South. Formerly enslaved people refashioned their own local communities first by changing their views of themselves from enslaved workers to hired laborers and more independent persons. They also reshaped relations of power by emphasizing their relationship to each other more than their relationship to white authority. When laborers contested wages or departed for better wages elsewhere, they also demonstrated a desire to mitigate their own economic dependency. Union occupation and the bureaucratic form of the labor contract itself needed adjustment to synchronize with the gendered reality of Black labor in Civil War Louisiana. Because the Union Army recruited so many Black men, much of the remaining labor force on plantations was female, which the signed contract forms later reflected. The word women always had to be written into the phrase printed at the top of the sheet, which read, I, the undersigned, have this day hired the following colored men to work. Repeatedly, the forms have the words and women or plus women shoehorned into the phrase, or with men struck out entirely and women written in its place. With many Black men on the move, whether in the Union Army or in search of more favorable work conditions, Black women and children often found themselves isolated in the fields. Not only did the male-centric labor forms rhetorically exclude women, but writing in their presence hardly acknowledged the disadvantages of the more immobile and materially depleted Black female laborer. Unfortunately, union recruitment practices could resemble the harsh realities of slavery, especially when union officials impressed Black men at gunpoint or even separated them from their families. Rather than silently suffer under negligence or abuse from the military government, laborers and recruits demanded accountability and protection from union occupiers. In August 1864, recruits in the 93rd USCT balked at the mistreatment of their family members on the government-operated Wofford plantation overseen by Enos Smith. Quote, "Numerous complaints have been made to me by men of my company in regard to the treatment of their wives and children," Captain Jason White reported from Berwick City in St. Mary Parish. Smith had apparently denied rations and medicine to one soldier's wife because she was ill and could not work. Quote, "The woman has been for weeks subsisting on what she could beg from others," unquote. Smith committed other depredations, the soldiers informed White, such as cutting wages, not issuing rations to children, and charging exorbitant prices for provisions to the extent that many of the laborers were in debt to him and incapable of buying their way to solvency. Although Stearns alleviated the suffering of the laborers on the Wofford plantation, his actions proceeded from the complaint of Black recruits. Too often, as this example indicated, the Union Army did little to protect the Black family. The Black family had to protect itself. Black women also pressed on the bureaucracy of occupation in search of justice. In April of 1864, Thomas Conway conveyed a wrathful message to his superior, George Hanks. A New Orleans woman reported to Conway that a U.S. officer, quote, "came to her house and took the child of her colored servant back to its former owner," unquote. The mother of the stolen child appealed to Conway. Quote, "The child is virtually returned to slavery by a U.S. officer," Conway exclaimed. "In the name of the liberty which crowns the achievement of our arms, in the name of justice and humanity, I beg that this case be presented to the attention of General Bowen, in order that he may punish the offender in the surest and most peremptory manner," unquote. Inspired in part by the ire of the Black community surrounding the case, Conway related to Hanks, quote, "The colored population is being moved by a deep and intense feeling on account of these abuses," unquote. For the Black community in New Orleans, made up in large part by female domestic laborers, Union occupation demonstrated a troubling duality. It generated familiar injustices, yet also provided an authentic space for their urgent claims to justice and self-advocacy. With the theft of this child, the specter of slavery again gained corporality in the very homes where Black women worked as free laborers. Their voices of protest moved Union officials like Conway to action. Quote, "They are willing to die for the government," he wrote, "but consider that this sort of abuse is not what they deserve," unquote. Isolated in the private homes of white people, in physical proximity to former owners, liberated women daily disrupted established power dynamics. As independent laborers, Black female household workers in New Orleans stood at the fringes of social inclusion. As emancipated persons contending for representative value, they called at the doorways of Union authority to challenge reincarnations of the slave regime. Hanks forwarded Conway's letter up the chain of command, quote, "with the remark that this is not an isolated instance," unquote. Dealt an injustice by the police power of Union occupation, the child's mother pressured and utilized that police power, however complex, back in her favor. When the child was returned and the officer arrested, it was the work of Union officers, but also the voice of the formerly enslaved, especially Black women, that fashioned justice from grievance. In the informal war that raged after Union forces pushed away Confederates in South Louisiana, Confederate reprisal threatened Black labor and communities. On forays to Emily Schiff's Belgrove plantation in Iberville Parish, rebels frightened off several overseers and carried away numerous supplies and laborers. Albert Gaylord, a planter neighboring Schiff, stated that Confederate raiders attacked his plantation and many others in the parish, carrying off scores of laborers. A formerly enslaved woman named Sophie Jones reported that rebels had captured her elderly father, whom tragically they later killed. Confederates did not only wage a war against Union occupiers, they attacked the stability of the Black family and its economic independence. In occupied Louisiana, where Union authority did not always translate into enhanced Black freedom and social inclusion, local mobility became a key feature of Black community. After a number of Confederate raids, John Willis and 4 other laborers decided to leave the Belgrove plantation. Despite the protests of a remaining plantation overseer, Willis selected a mule and a cart and departed for a nearby Union outpost at Donaldsonville. Quote, "Nobody gave us permission to take it or the mule," he testified, "but I wanted to save the mule and myself," unquote. Willis and company rode straight to the provost marshal, who immediately rebuked them for traveling without a pass. The overseer followed after the laborers to retrieve the mule. Quote, "The provost marshal told him he could not have it, nor take us back," unquote, Willis testified. But the overseer made a second journey with proof of ownership for the mule and convinced Willis and the others to return with him. Despite his efforts to return the laborers, Emily Schiff lacked work and wages for them, in part because of Confederate attacks which depleted her property. And she ordered the overseer to release Willis and 25 other hands. Mobility was also an essential function of the informal Black economy. Even without passes, jobless Black workers turned to the nearest Union outpost or roamed to another plantation in search of work. Laborers also employed themselves or liberated supplies from plantations on which they worked if they were not paid. Black laborers also faced white resistance to their education in occupied territory. From St. James Parish, Board of Education agent Nathan Wiley also wrote the provost marshal to account for numerous incidents of white oppression. Quote, "I find that many children are prevented from attending school because the white people for whom their parents labor turn them into the street if they send their children to the colored schools," unquote. On several occasions, Wiley saw Black families forced off local properties with all of their furniture in the road simply because parents sent their children to school. When he heard of planters refusing to board teachers on their property, General Banks tried to articulate an essential connection between land and education. In a letter to the provost marshals of St. James and St. John parishes in June of 1864, he expressed that, quote, "It is indispensable to the cultivation of the soil that schools for colored children shall be maintained. The policy of the government demands this," unquote. Banks understood the systemic interdependence that tethered labor to education. Quote, "Unless laborers are assured that the education of their children will be provided for, they become discontented and will be allowed to remove to parishes where such provisions are made," unquote. Black discontent with white resistance to education threatened Banks's dependence on their labor in occupied Louisiana. Their desire to work and learn unimpeded pressured Banks to use military authority against recalcitrant white property owners. Ultimately, occupation recalibrated, but did not reconstitute democracy. Union troops freed enslaved people, but imposed specific boundaries on their labor, mobility, and autonomy within the world of occupation. They also often protected white property and enacted no comprehensive redistribution of land and resources to Black people. Consequently, at Liberty's Gate, these new Americans in becoming experienced freedom mingled with exclusion. Attenuated access to the material foundation of American democracy compromised the potential of Union occupation to reorder society. The careful, uneven dismantling of slavery was beginning an end to a revolution in Southern society, not only because Southerners remained culturally unreconstructed, but primarily because occupation as a system of government practice failed to elucidate a permanent recharacterization of American citizenship on the basis of race. Yet within the parameters of Union-occupied Louisiana, formerly enslaved people contended for a better physical world that they could make with their own hands. Thank you.
Excellent. If we were in person, we would be on our feet applauding both of these very fine papers. Let me start, if I may, with some comments. The late John Hope Franklin often said, and I quote, "You cannot understand what white America is doing until you understand and appreciate what Black Americans are doing." There's an action and reaction, point, counterpoint, push and pull, oppression and opposition, yin and yang, as they would say in China, as these papers so aptly represent. These very fine papers further show and demonstrate why we need to institute Black studies or African American history from pre-K to college and into graduate school. James, I thought we was on our way there in the late 60s and early 70s, but little did I know that the clock would turn back. If we did have Black studies and it was mandatory, this would help us redeem the soul of America. Gwendolyn Midlo Hall in her Africans in Colonial Louisiana says that the survival of French Louisiana was due to the African laborers. And these papers exhibit that in terms of these Black individuals keeping their eyes on the prize. Professor Wilson's fine paper, indicates how race relations, although nowhere near ideal, was a little better than it became during the Jim Crow era. West Felician racial relationships was friendly, and the various trades and entrepreneurial spirits that existed among the free persons of color, especially women. She even indicated, perhaps in an earlier version, I don't know if that's the one she left some comments in, that, quote, "no segregation in the parish and no Black communities," as she shows the locations of where their properties were. Especially impressive was the land ownership. And this is kind of similar to what New Orleans exhibited according to Dale Summers in his article in the Journal of Southern History and other writers. The relationship of biracial children was especially noteworthy. Wilson connections of the LSU rejected African Charles Hatfield's history to these same free people of color, and his pivotal part in the establishment of Southern University Law School is so appropriate and fascinating to me, which was part of her first initial research. One of her books dealt with Mr. Hatfield's effort to integrate the law school at LSU, which led, along with the decision out of Missouri, to the establishment of the Southern University Law School. So these struggles continue today, this very, very day for African Americans. I'm looking forward to Professor Wilson's further research to see what political part these individuals will play in Reconstruction and the Civil War, because Port Hudson was just up the road from Bayou Sara. And I want to know if any of these free people of color, this is a historian just wanting to know more, if they may have been part of those soldiers there at the effort to lay siege to Port Hudson, as well as the political arena of Reconstruction. I know at least two Blacks that was from there, a gentleman named Robert Taylor. I didn't see his name in your work, maybe he had not arrived, and J.W. Umstead, both of whom served in the legislature. And Umstead was served as sheriff in that parish. Just queries that I have, more work for you to do, and more reading for me to do. Ward's Building Freedom Under Union Occupation shows how Black people understood their situation and tried to refashion their communities. They worked, men and women, on levees in New Orleans and the Orleans Parish and Jefferson Parish, with and without contract. They wanted to strengthen and protect their family, wanted education, complained about mistreatment and the brutality of Black workers, confronted Confederate Confederate reprisals, and when all else failed, left, walked off the job, tools, supplies. It shows their resilience and strong focus on enhancing the families, especially Black women. I'm impressed that both papers show the strength of the Black women. I was at a conference once, a prayer breakfast, and the speaker started, I used this with my students. He said, this is at a prayer breakfast, James. He said, I love women. And I just stopped, dropped my fork. I said, what did this pastor say? He said, but I'm infatuated with Black women. Everybody else dropped that fork. But he was saying that because the Black women have had to do two things, as we said in the 60s. They were slaves of slaves. They have been the backbone, the conveyors of our culture. And I too am just infatuated with Black women. My mother, strong Black women, 5 sisters, my daughter. So I'm surrounded by women who keep me straight. And Jonathan, they could all whip me too, let me say that, including if I can't run, I run my daughter, she'll get a switch off. This paper of Professor Ward makes a strong case for reparation. Now, we've been there and we talk about that and we give it lip service. It confirms the view of Leon Litwack's North of Slavery, which highlights some of the views of Northerners towards Black. I know that Mr. Ward will look at the voluminous edited works by Ira Berlin because both papers use a lot of primary sources, so maybe he's in the Freedmen Bureau papers, but as he read his paper, I remember looking at Ira Berlin and the Freedmen Bureau long project, which he produced about 6 or 8 volumes. And some of those same correspondence I had a chance to read that is fairly extensive of soldiers trying to get the army to look after their families and women writing about their conditions under these occupied camps and during the war itself, as well as the work by Ashley White on the Freedmen Bureau in Louisiana. I didn't notice that in your footnote, nor Ira Berlin's work. These 2 papers, and I don't think our 3rd one has come online. These 2 papers, the positive of them, as I've indicated, all use a good number of primary sources. Professor Wilson's paper doesn't use a secondary source almost. And she has gone through those conveyance records, the census there, and those PowerPoint presentations was just simply outstanding. You could understand them, you could see where the properties were located, and they were throughout the town of St. Francisville. Good number of primary sources, number 1, both papers. Secondly, these papers show that these were vocal Black responses. Professor Ward shows that the Black women complain of their mistreatment. They wanted a better life for their families, as did the Black men. Ward shows that they protested. They tried to protect their family. Another theme that's in these papers is that, thirdly, there was wholesale mistreatment of Blacks. Wholesale mistreatment. The drum still beats in too many areas of our community as a product of the civil rights movement, the Great Society, the war on poverty. I can attest to what I witnessed in the 60s and some of the things I even witnessed today. Black children being taken, Professor Ward indicated. The brutality of Black workers, Professor Ward's paper also showed. And no schools, Professor Wilson showed. And in both cases, there was an effort to keep education away from Black people. No land or resources in many cases. And lastly, both of these papers fourthly show that Black people protested. They protested. Professor Ward tells of the Blacks leaving with the mules and the carts and taking the utensils and anything they could to protest their condition, knowing that they deserved better condition, knowing that they were going to have to take it by any means necessary almost. And I will stop here. And if there are questions from those in the audience, the chat room is available. And any comments they want to say to your questions or to my comments, we can do that at the end, or we can start with reactions at this point if you have any to my comments. But I certainly want to give others who are listening a chance to react to these very fine papers by these two young scholars. So the chat room is open, right, James?
So Dr. Vincent, the first question is in the chat room was addressed to me. And I want to thank everybody for attending, especially my fan club, Anne and Natalie. Her question asks why people were drawn to St. Francisville and Bayou Sara. Were they more liberal places for free people of color or for people who wanted these mixed relationships? And my answer is, I think it's because it's a brand new area. So the population of the area was 237 in 1793. So that's not a lot of people, right? And so we've got a wide open frontier area, anything goes, nobody's looking at anything, everybody's just trying to make their way. I think people were attracted to the area because it was new, it was open, it was available, and people came. I think that the rules that separated people came after people were already settled. So Warren Miltier has done some work in North Carolina, and he found lots of mixed couples, especially white females and Black males, who were having children, Native Americans and Blacks having children together. Nobody considered this a bad thing. Nobody began to punish this until later on. After the community became more settled, then there was more of a disfavoring of these mixed relationships. And I think it's in order to protect slavery. I think that the notion of keeping people apart supports enslavement by skin color. Where if you let people mix, then you've got some confusion about who's a slave and who's not, and why. I think that's the problem. So I don't think that there was any reputation for being a more liberal place. I don't think that that could have been communicated, to anyone. I think people just went to a new place and there were no rules in the new place. I always joke that I hate California because there's no rule there. Anything goes. And that's that newness, that openness that it has. And that goes into the second question on the chat line, that sketching how the history of St. Francisville and Bayou Sara contrasts with Cane River. Cane River was settled much earlier than the Bayou Sara area. Again, I'm looking at 1793, only 237 people were there. And it's again owned by the Spanish. Cane River area was also owned by the Spanish, but it's settled much earlier. In Cane River, the biggest discussions that you hear coming out of Cane River is that one family, the Twider, I think is the name. The father, the white slaveholding father, gave land to his children and to his paramour, okay, large acreage of land, and that size of an estate was not given in West Louisiana Parish. So we don't have people who start out with large lands and had enslaved populations to earn those lands. So we don't have that generation of income that we found in King River. In my readings about King River, it seems that people measured status not by skin shade, the way they did sort of in New Orleans, but by how long your family has been free. So if your great grandmother has been free, then you have higher status than if your mother had been free. And if you were just became free, then you had even lower status than that. So there's a difference in the way people looked at and understood one another. King River, there was a separation. In fact, this white slaveholder who gave all this land to his children separated from their mother because he wanted to become a part of the white society. So he lived happily with the mother for 15, 20 years, but then white society says you gotta choose. You're either a part of white society or you can maintain the household that you have. And so he says, okay, I've got to put you out, but I'm gonna give you this land, I'm gonna give all the kids this land, and then I'm gonna marry somebody else so I can start going to the parties with other white folks. So I think that's a very different story than what we have in St. Francisville. St. Francisville is newly settled. I didn't come across any case where there was a family-like structure that then separated the person remarried. The cases I came across were usually the fella had married a white woman, the white slaveholder had married a white woman, and either the white woman died or there was a divorce, and then he took up the enslaved woman who he laid free. That was the more common occurrence in St. Francisville. So yeah, one thing about the history of people in St. Francisville and by Sarah, that West Louisiana Parish, is that it's very short. I'm looking only at the 1820 to 1830 because, again, there weren't very many people there, although I understand there was at least one free person of color who owned land as early as 1802. But their history is much shorter, where in the King River area, the history is much longer duration.
I think there's some questions in here for me, so I'm going to jump in, if that's all right. The first one I got privately from Paul Hoffman. I think he's still in here. To what degree did the contract system preview the later sharecropping regime? And that's a good question. I wish I knew more about sharecropping than I do to be able to answer that question more efficiently. But there are two distinctions in my mind that I can think of immediately. The first is the contract labor system has direct oversight from the union military, whether they are owning that property for themselves and union officers are employing formerly enslaved people, or if they're leasing it out to either northerners who come down and are looking to hit it big with southern crops, especially cotton, or local southerners who sign a loyalty oath. The Union Army has control to some extent over wages, treatment, where these laborers were sleeping, what they were eating. Later on with the sharecropping system, of course, that's not true. Much of the Union Army had gone by then, and Black laborers and that system had a lot less autonomy. And the second thing would be there's slightly more mobility. I know I talked about limitations of Black mobility under Union occupation, and certainly the Union Army was trying to constantly sort of keep their eye on where everyone was moving, Black and white. But there is, sorry, someone is texting me, some more mobility under the contract system with enslaved people moving around, looking for family members, looking for better contracts, better conditions. So I think that sort of dissipated with the sharecropping system. So the two major distinctions there that I would think of. There's another question here from Bia. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. I had a friend in undergrad who spelled and pronounced her name that way, so that's what I'm going to say. I don't think I know any Adolph Connor off the top of my head. I've been digging through primary records from the National Archives for several years now. So if I have come across him, I probably wouldn't remember right away. But what I can do is keyword search all of the records that I've transcribed so far. And if you want to shoot me your email, I can communicate with you more about that. I see at the bottom you're wondering how common it was for free people of color to own slaves themselves. I'm not sure whether that question is directed at me or at Evelyn, but I would say it wasn't unheard of, but it was relatively rare. I don't know if you want to chime in on that question, Evelyn.
Yeah, and I want to say what I found was that the free people of color in West Louisiana Parish who owned slaves who were not their family members also owned land. So it was the thing to do if you had, or they had a business. Okay, so the people that I mentioned, not with her, she had lots of children, but Wooten and Dowse and the other fella, the last one, all had one or two slaves in their businesses to help them with their businesses. People who owned land had slaves to help them with their, I don't want to say gardening, with their planting and harvesting of their crops. So slavery was very widespread throughout West Louisiana Parish. Not everybody owned slaves, but people who had, it was not alien. Okay? Whipper is kind of an exception of somebody who said, I'm able to buy a slave, but I choose not to. She did other things with her money. She helped other people with her money instead of, but most of the people of color who had businesses that used labor would have enslaved labor rather than have free labor. So I don't know if you would say it's common or not common, but it was not considered something that you don't do because you also share the same skin color. I just think skin color just wasn't that important. Your status, whether you're free or whether you're enslaved, was much more important. If I can also, Dr. Vincent raised some questions that trying to send me off to do work that I've already done. So I want to answer your questions. You asked about whether or not any of the people from West Louisiana served in the military during the war, and I found that a couple did. Richard Dowse, who is Charles Hatfield's grandfather, did serve in the Union Army. He was in Mississippi, stationed on Ship Island, and in fact he was injured fighting against Confederate soldiers in Pascagoula, Mississippi. It was a very short, I don't know how short war ever is, you're in the middle of it, but it wasn't a big major fight at all. The Union Army had gone in, they took down the Confederate flag off a hotel. The Confederates shot back at them, and so they went back to their ship. And he actually may have been hit by friendly fire as the ship was supporting the troops on land. So he did join with the Army. And then John Purnell, who would have been a great uncle of Richard Hatfield, Charles Hatfield, joined the 3rd Louisiana Native Guard Infantry. And so he did participate in that siege of Fort Hudson. And he also fought on the Red River campaign. And then 2 of the other Purnells signed up when the Union Army took over Baton Rouge. They required able men to sign up, and they did sign up, but I don't know that they served. And then your second question was about free people of color in politics. From what I understand, the politics were sort of, in West Louisiana Parish, were controlled by Armstead. And I don't believe that Armstead was free before the Civil War. I believe that he had been enslaved. I think his father was a white man, but that he was not freed until after the Civil War. The people of who were the elected officials, and there were a bunch of them, judges and not judges, I'm sorry, not judges, but I'm trying to find my list. School board people, people who served, there was a institution for the mentally ill up in the parish, and people who served on the board of supervisors of that institution. All these different elected officials, many of them were held by the same 5 or 6 Black men, most of whom could not read or write, most of whom had not been freed before the Civil War. So none of the free people of color that I identified as having been free before the Civil War served in any political positions.
Wow.
In fact, what I found was that 40% of the free people of color in the parish left the parish between 1850 and 1860. And I believe they left because, as I've been saying, when the parish is new, everything is okay, everybody's friendly. And then in 1850, 1860, the parish starts taking this hard line in defense of slavery. And they look around and they say, we need to protect slavery. And protecting slavery requires us to be unfriendly to true people of color. And people of color just go left. So I thought that was interesting.
Good. Are there other questions or comments? Thank you so much for that. Okay. Boy, while they're getting their questions together, I see a number of thank yous from Ann Delano, from Professor Daniel Ursher, from Bo Paul, I guess you would say. Jonathan was thanking all the participants and everyone who was on the line. I think there was as many as 25 I counted at one time, and they might still be there. So don't be bashful. Just ask your questions. You see, these experts are ready to answer them. We have about 16 minutes yet to go. So Evelyn, you didn't have to cut your paper down after all. But you've answered some of my questions which go beyond your paper. That's great. Let's see if this is a question. As you know, that as we're still in attendance, James has gotten about 3 messages concerning the other sessions of the Louisiana Historical Association. We got others on December the 17th, entitled The Many Faces of Race in Louisiana, December the 17th. And I hope you can read the other questions here. A number of individuals are thanking us for this session. Was this Henry Robertson, Jacob Gautreaux, thanking everyone and inviting them to the session on the 17th. Ryan Gray and Jonathan Matthew Waters, thanking all of you for thanking them.
And I'd like to add my thanks.
Yes, I certainly want to add mine.
There's one other question about the Colonialization Society in Louisiana.
Yes.
And I didn't research that, okay, but I have come across it mentioned in some of the books, and it did function in Louisiana. There was a group of, I don't know, somewhere around 320 or something like that, that left out of New Orleans, and I think somebody had something like scarlet fever or something, and most of them died on the way to Liberia. But it did function in Louisiana, and you might just look that up, colonization in Louisiana. And Anne is telling us about Charles Mcnicken, and he did, but I think his contribution went to people who were leaving Indiana and Illinois, and not to people who were leaving Louisiana. But he made this $5,000 contribution to the society. And also, Mcnicken was best friends of an organizer in Ohio, so he may have done it not because he believed in it. I need to say this to Anne, not because he believed in colonization, but because he was helping his friend along. I just want to point out that there are, prior to the Civil War, there were meetings of free people of color in other states, not in Louisiana. I saw no record of people in Louisiana meeting, but there were meetings of people who were mostly in the northern states. And they were big objectors to colonization. They felt that they deserved like capitalism, the right to remain in the United States where they had left their blood, sweat, and tears, where many of them had been born. Because remember, the slave importation was criminalized in 1808. And although we know a lot of people were brought into the country after that, most of the people who were enslaved in the United States had been born in the United States. So they felt that this was their home. This is, in fact, gosh, I'll have to find her name, has written a book where she says that people in Baltimore made a case for birthright citizenship that was later made a part of the 14th Amendment. And her argument is that the initial concept of birthright citizenship came from free people of color in Baltimore.
Are you talking about Martha Jones' book?
Thank you. I was about to find it. Yes, Martha Jones. Thank you. Yes.
It's a great book.
Yeah.
And I'll add to that I don't touch much on antebellum studies, but because Louisiana, if you think of Louisiana as being part of the Caribbean world for a moment and less about being a part of the United States, there were many French-speaking Black people who looked at places like Cuba or Haiti, especially after the Haitian Revolution, as a place to go. They wouldn't necessarily call that colonizing, but they took a look at the United States and the increasing racial oppression during the 30s through the 50s, essentially. And there were a good number of people who left and moved deeper into the Caribbean, and they saw that as an opportunity to have greater access to Black culture and to more freedom. It's slightly different than white schemes for colonization, which are, embedded with paternalistic ideology. But it's important to remember that some Black people did look at leaving the United States as their only option.
There's a question from B. Hall. Does anyone know of any slave revolts in Louisiana? Before all of us come through the camera to tell her about the many day-to-day resistance and the 1811, I want to give my colleagues a chance, these presenters. Yes, there were, and they'll start to list in some of these slave revolts, in addition to the one of 1811, which was one of the largest in the country.
Absolutely, 1811, the largest slave revolt that we know of. We don't have exact numbers for how many people participated in it, somewhere between 200 and 500, but it was a very large body of people.
And I'd like to mention the Whitney Museum has an exhibit on that revolt.
Yes.
And I recommend that.
And certainly the National Museum, if you get to Washington, D.C., give yourself 2 weeks to go through that museum. It is just loaded with great information. But there was always a day-to-day resistance to slavery that was in small accounts. But the 1811 one is the one, as Jay indicated, that is noted in every textbook almost on slave revolts. And then the Milo incidents of these maroon societies down there right outside New Orleans that Gilbert Den talks about, where they actually escaped into the swamps and were never enslaved, kind of like Palmares in Brazil. I know Paul will tell us a lot about that if you want to know about that. But yes, there were slave revolts.
And
And
Paul,
I'll add, oh, go ahead.
Paul Huffman has noted a 1795
That's
plot
right.
repressive point of view,
That's right.
and it reminded me of rumors of a slave revolt in West Louisiana Parish, and they just executed 3 people and nothing seemed to come of it. It seemed to be also that it was more rumor than actual revolt.
Yeah, that was part of the slave system, especially in the antebellum South. Slave owners being constantly afraid of rebellions and using that as an excuse to have increased social control over enslaved Black people. There's a book I have over here, Broken Burn, the journal of Kate Stone.
Yes.
She talks about very early on in the war, and near July 4th, 1861, everyone in Madison Parish were expecting a slave uprising to attack and seize a mine near where she lived. And so these kinds of rumors were constant, but also the real thing. I have other instances throughout my dissertation that I'm finishing up now that I find in newspaper accounts during Union occupation, if especially before the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, if the Union Army would not liberate enslaved people or sometimes even return them to the plantations nearby in southern Louisiana, they would rebel. They would fight even Union troops. They would get cane knives, any sort of weapon they could get their hands on, and they would march toward Union outposts and into New Orleans. And I've found newspaper accounts of these sort of attacks. And Union soldiers are just as afraid of these rebellions as white Southerners, because many of them believe that as soon as you take away slavery, take away any sort of social control over Black people, they will extract vengeance on white Americans. And for the most part, that wasn't true. For the most part, Black people were ready to begin their own independent lives. They weren't interested in this giant bloodbath of revenge, as many scholars have written about. But finally, the Union Army figures out if formerly enslaved people in Louisiana are this eager to fight for their freedom, they'll make really good soldiers. And they weren't always treated with respect, as I even talked about today. But those rebellions are connected. You know, some people refer to Black recruitment in the Civil War as the largest slave rebellion that happened in American history. So something to think about.
I think more interesting than even rebellions is the runaways. There's one instance at least where a fellow was riding a horse and people tried to stop him, and it turned out that he had been sent to town to buy some groceries or whatever, and there were like 6 or 8, 10 people who were hiding out in the woods, and he was the one person who had been sent to town to get food for them. So this idea of running away and staying in the woods for a period of time, from Louisiana, it probably would be difficult to get to the north, but you might be able to get into Texas or into Mexico. You might be able to catch a boat and leave the state altogether through a boat. But that as a means of resistance rather than an organized revolt is much more common.
We still have about 4 to 5 minutes, so you have enough time to ask your questions, even if you've got a question coming from New Iberia. I see Dr. Hayes on the phone. We'd love to have a question from New Iberia. Jacob, I see you. Don't be afraid to ask your question, because these scholars have presented us with just a plethora of great information, and we just can't wait for these presentations to appear in print, book forms, article forms, just however they want to present them to us. James wanted me to say once again, we always do a commercial on December the 17th. We'll come back with another online session. If you want to join the Louisiana Historical Association, it's a very easy task. Just go online and Professor James Wilson will be happy to accommodate all that you possibly want to do in terms of joining and becoming a member. It has been a tremendously uh, informative and beneficial organization for me and for the state of Louisiana and so many others. Okay, I see this picture of a nice house there.
I see another question about the Underground Railroad. I don't know of any instances of the Underground Railroad in Louisiana, but that could just be my ignorance. Evelyn, do you know of any?
I haven't heard of anything at all. There was one instance where Walker's appeal was found in New Orleans, and the fellow was arrested, put in jail for it. So it's not. So I know that there was some information coming into the state, but I haven't heard of anything like that. But Professor Sheehan Dean has done a work with the group that's doing a study of people who escaped slavery and then measures where they're caught using slave ads and advertisements. So he may have that kind of information. That may be a person to whom to direct that question. He's dean at the Department of History at LHA.
And certainly the works of the late Dr. Judith Keller Schaefer, where she looks at all the court cases, would be a good place for someone who was interested in seeing why some of these slave court cases was brought, as well as her book, Becoming Free and Remaining Free on New Orleans, and why these individuals were brought to court or brought court suits themselves. But you're right, that's kind of an unknown event there. At least it has not gotten the credit that we have uncovered in the state. But I'm certain that there was some Harriet Tubmans out there. Let's hope so. I know that they've been incognito. Okay, let's see if we got any other question. Another thank you from B with lots of love.
There's a question that was sent to me privately that's probably more appropriate for J. Matthew Ward. The role of veterans, Union veterans, in establishing historically Black communities after the war.
In Louisiana?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Didn't come across that at all?
Not so far, but I tend to stay pretty narrowly focused on the war itself.
And I'm pre-war, so
yeah.
No. I'm sorry, we don't have an answer to that. We have not found.
Someone has done it, the panel.
Books on Black history about rural northern Louisiana. There's a book about Cane River, but I don't know about anything northeast Louisiana. Anybody's written about that at all?
Yeah, I don't know any books specifically about northern Louisiana.
Yeah. Now the works by Willie Burden, these was kind of locally published on Shreveport, the black side of Shreveport. We just lost Professor Burden last year. He was at Suzbo for a long time. Willie Burden. And then he has the second book entitled The Sweet of the Berries. The Black of the Berries, The Sweet of the Juice. But Willie Burden, B-U-R-T-O-N, has done a number of very fine locally published books where he has taken the Shreveport Sun and used all those files. That was a prominent Black paper. But it's fairly recent what his work deals with. He was a very prodigious scholar there at Suzbo, And he has done a lot of work on Shreveport in that area, the Caddo Parish, Red River area in terms of blacks, especially Shreveport. And for a long time, he did a calendar, which was featured black achievers. This is the area, as you know, where Dr. Jesse Stone came out of the Shreveport area, who was president of Southern for a long time, as well as Dr. Leon Tolver. They are from the Shreveport area. So for information on that area of North Louisiana, Willie Burden, and certainly those are two gentlemen who, one of whom is deceased. I understand that Dr. Tolver is working on something that he tells me about occasionally when I run into him about his ancestry, and I'm looking forward to it because it's fascinating what he tells me. But that's as you all have said, there's kind of a sparsity of information there. But certainly my friend, the late Willie Burden, has done a lot on 20th century Shreveport in terms of cataloging events and achievements there, institutions and churches and things of that nature, civil rights activity.
James Wilson has recommended Ted Tunnell's book, Tunnell, on the chat.
I can't hear that. That'll be the last.
James Wilson has recommended Ted Tunnell's books.
Oh, Ted Tunnell. Yes, Ted Tunnell books on, yes, my friend Ted over there at Virginia Commonwealth. He has his Crucibles of Reconstruction and his Marshall Twitchell book. He edited the papers of Marshall Twitchell, who was a Freedmen Bureau agent up there in the Shreveport area. Thank you, James, for that. Yes, yes, Ted Tunnell of Ted Tunnell. I think he's still at Virginia Commonwealth. That's where he was the last time I had a chance to talk to Ted. Okay. If there are no other questions, I know that you want to give these two presenters LOL, as they said, not laugh out loud, lots of love. As I do, these have been some fabulous papers. So in your own way, lift your glass of water to Professor Evelyn Wilson and Professor J. Matthews Ward for these very fine papers. And with that, we thank them. We thank you for listening. We thank you for being online with us.